Read on in verse 6, chapter 4. It says, "And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, 'Abba, Father.' So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God." See, so that you might experience the fullness of him. I mean, and out of that experience actually make change, Like when you act and when you're talking to people that you'll see change, but that change isn't you. Francis Chan defines it well in his book, Forgotten God. It says this: "The world is not moved by love or actions that are of human creation, and the church is not empowered to live differently from any other gathering of people without the Holy Spirit. But when believers live in the power of the Spirit, the evidence in their lives is supernatural. The church cannot help but be different, and the world cannot help but notice." Man, that's a really cool picture of the Trinity, isn't it? That God chose the time when his Son would come, that Jesus came down and lived a perfect life, died for us, and offers us salvation, and the Holy Spirit actually allows us to experience God now. That we can experience him now. But does that mean that we don't have to do anything? We're like, "Oh man, God's got this. Jesus, take the wheel," right? No, that's not what it's saying. And you still have to pour into that relationship. It's like this, all right? If you're coming to church and that's all you do, it's like this, where you're like, "Man, if I was to tell you everything about my dad, like everything, told you how he loved my mom, how he cared for my siblings and me, how he invested time, how he was really, really cared about our personal spiritual conditions, all these good things, how funny he was. Man, he was a hoot. Like just being around him, he was fun." You see, you might say, "Man, Chris, you're a lucky guy to have that dad. You're blessed, you're privileged to have him as a dad." And you might even say, "Man, I wish I could have known him. Wish I could have experienced some of that." But what you'd never say is "Man, I love him too now, Daddy." What? Well, that'd be awkward. But it wasn't awkward or weird for my wife. My wife, who considered him a father, who was invested in that relationship, and people who knew him loved him. So that's the point here, that you have to actually make an invested effort. You have to intentionally be part of this relationship with God. That's super important. See, so we're not just left alone. You see, but it says that we can actually approach God then in a different way. It says this, that we can cry out, that our heart's crying, "Abba, Father." I picture this like my son when he's in his room at night and he's just like, "Daddy!" And I run into the room and I kick open the door and I'm just like ready to wrestle a bear. And he's like, "I'm cold." I'm like, all right, I'm cold, right? I go back to bed. And I hear it again, "Daddy!" And I run into his room again. And he's like, "I'm scared. Can you just hug me?" I'm like, "Yeah, I can hug you." I go back to bed. He's like, "Daddy, can you just stay for a little longer? I just got to be close to you right now. I just got to feel you near me." And I'll go back every time. If I can do that for my son as a broken, sinful human, imagine what the God of the universe can do for you. The access you have to him as a child of God, that's what he's saying. This is like your prayer life, that you can cry out, that it's no longer just some canned prayer that you just like recite at dinner time because that's what you do. No, but it's filled with warmth and passion. That there's heart there. That you care about him and you understand how much he cares about you. That he opens up his family and says, "Just come in." It's an amazing picture. And it's not just a collective picture. Read this last verse 7 that we're going to touch. "So you are no longer a slave but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. So you." So you. This is intentionally an individual expression. It's not a collective, it's so you. I mean, being part of the church, coming into the church is not enough to know Jesus and to be part of that. It's an individual step. It's an individual thing where God grants you that faith. Man, I remember my life. Like, man, I grew up in a Christian home. I had every opportunity to know Jesus. See, but when God actually grabbed my heart, I wasn't just Chris with more religion. I was already that. Man, I knew all the, like, I was in church all the time. I got to know all the ins and outs, right? I knew how to play the game. But I had no motivations. I didn't care to honor God in what I did. I was a hypocrite. I'd come in on Sundays and I'd go home a totally different person. But in that community on the outside, man, yeah, you'd say I had it together. I was a mess. But when God grabbed my heart, When he transformed my life, I was actually tangibly different. Because the very core of who I was different. It's not that I was acting the same. It's that my motivations, my desires, who I was, had changed. So you. This is God just calling out to you guys. Being like, so you. So you. What are your priorities this year? What are your intentions this year? What are you actually saying you're going to do this year? Because if the point isn't Jesus, then you got to reorient. If the point is your image and not your imager, there's an issue. See, I think the simplest way to say this is that the big change happened when I really understood that it wasn't about me. It's not about me. It's about him. It's about what he's done and what he gives to you freely.